Hello and welcome to this 18th edition of the International Conference on the Quality of Education. This year's theme is dedicated to highlighting key determinants for improving learning outcomes based on data analysis from teams, peers, and PISA. After the opening session, I am delighted to moderate this first session in the presence of four great guests: Dr. Aaron BENAVOT from USA, Dr. Janet Lord from United Kingdom, Dr. Hanan KHALIFA from United Kingdom, and Dr. Mario BRUN from Argentina. Our first speaker is Dr. Aaron BENAVOT from the University at Albany in the USA. BENAVOT has also worked as a director of the UNESCO Education for All Global Monitoring Report. Welcome, Aaron, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Your presentation's title is Will Global Learning Metrics Based on International Assessments like PISA, TEAMS, and PERS Solve the Global Learning Crisis? A great question to resolve.
So thank you very much for this honor and privilege to present at this very important international meeting. I'm very pleased to be able to make a presentation, and I will ask my colleague to go ahead and move through the different slides that I prepared. So the presentation that I have organized is around the question of global learning metrics, which have been constructed in recent years based in large part of the international learning assessments like PISA, TIMSS, and PEARLS. And in many sectors, there are claims that the construction of these global learning metrics will help solve what is referred to as the global learning crisis. Next, please. My presentation is organized in three parts. Next slide, please. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the global learning crisis and how it's being addressed. And then I want to speak briefly about three conditions that have led to the construction and dissemination of global learning metrics. And then I wish to conclude my presentation with some critical reflections and conclusions. Next slide, please. So it's important to keep in mind that historically this word crisis, learning crisis, or even a shock has been used in many times, certainly in the area of education, going back to the 1960s. Philip Coombs wrote about a world education crisis, in particular in the global South. Here in the United States, in the 1980s, there was a very important report that was published about a nation at risk that essentially saw that as a kind of a Sputnik moment that the US needed to reorient its education system. But even in the areas of adult literacy and adult education, there have been discussions around a world crisis. And certainly when the first PISA findings were published in 2000, in Germany in particular, there was a kind of a shock that triggered much public discussion and debate. Perhaps one of the first uses of the term global learning crisis was in the Global Education Monitoring Report, which I directed for 3.5 years between 2014 and 2017. It was based on a report that talked about 250 million children who couldn't read and write around the world, and close to 750 million adults that lack basic reading and writing skills. So in sum, while the crisis hyperbole has a long history in education circles, there is some sense that its prevalence is increasing, partly because many media outlets are simplifying the complexity of international learning assessments and amplifying this crisis narrative, and also because of the work of various kinds of educational reform movements. Next slide, please. And another way of thinking about this is that variation in learning outcomes, measured learning outcomes, is not new. It's been reported for decades, certainly in all the work of the IEA, and more recently by international agencies like the World Bank and UNESCO. But what is new is this idea that all countries or all children of school age can be placed on a ranking or a league table that are meant to kind of spur action. And in many instances, these league tables are used to direct certain blame to certain actors in the system, especially teachers, who are being held responsible for the provision of poor quality education. So what we see is that regardless of many differences across countries and education systems, the idea is to be able to place all learning levels on a single scale or single progression. So I'd like to talk about some of the conditions that led to this and also some critical questions about it. Next slide, please. Next slide. There is no single definition of a global learning metric. Next slide, please. Can you hear me? But it mainly refers to the fact that countries and country learning levels or learning-related indicators from different assessments are being combined together and placed on a single metric. UNESCO's Institute for Statistics discussed, for example, in theory, that an ideal global learning metric might be a perfectly equated learning assessment program which all countries participated in and they contributed to. That's obviously very unlikely anytime in the near future. So essentially what they've been doing is developing guiding tools to support the alignment and comparability of assessments at the international, regional, and even at the national level in order to be combined on a single metric. So a lot of countries that do carry out national learning assessments are being asked to recalibrate or examine these kind of methodologies and shared definitions so that they can report the findings of these assessments on a global scale. Next slide, please. I would say that although the interest in learning has a very long and important history among international education policymakers, this idea of a global learning metric is very new, and it really does transform much of the conventional way in which progress is either measured or discussed. So it's no longer about how many kids are in school, how many kids are out of school, who drops out, whether or not there's gender parity, but now almost entirely the emphasis is placed on learning outcomes. And so it really shifts the focus from inputs and to some extent processes, which were never highlighted in the past, to a concerted or focused emphasis exclusively on outputs and outcomes. Next slide, please. This gives you, keep on pushing. This gives you an idea of some of the many proxy measures that have been used in the past to look at poor quality education, low retention rates, large classrooms, insufficient instructional time, teachers that are either insufficiently qualified or teach in very poor conditions, insufficient expenditure, curricular structures that are conventional, focused only on subject disciplines or rote memorization, and among them, the idea of do students acquire and retain basic foundational skills like literacy and numeracy, which has emerged as the critical, as it were, proxy measure. Next slide. I'm going to pass through these slides just to say that this interest in learning has really kind of emerged in the last 2 decades, and especially after the Dakar conference in 2000. First of all, there was this initial shift from quantity to quality, or access plus learning. And the second shift was really about how to define quality and to focus almost exclusively on learning. Next slide. The World Bank has been at the forefront of the emphasis on the measurement and focus on learning outcomes. This certainly captures, these kind of results-oriented accountability models, and certainly the notion that all countries are in a kind of a global competition for the best skilled labor. Certainly Hanan and Mosman in some of the early work they did, which has been the target of much critique, basically made an argument that having skilled students who learn well cognitive skills is also a driver of economic growth. But one of the most important changes, as you'll see in just a moment, please, next slide, and move to the next slide, please, is the fact that, there's really been a proliferation of many different kinds of learning assessments. Now, in this conference, most of the emphasis is on the international assessments, which are on the top, the PISA, the TIMSS, the PEARLS, and maybe to a lesser extent, the ones around civics and civic education. But it's also important to keep in mind some of the regional assessments that have been fairly well established. Two of them in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, the SACMEC and PASEC, a very important one in Latin America, that there have been 3 different waves, and more recently, a regional assessment in the Pacific Islands around literacy and numeracy. In addition, there are, I would say, 3 other kinds of assessment types. National learning assessments, which have also expanded dramatically, as you'll see in just a moment, around the world, and citizen-led assessments using the model of Pratham in India. And this has expanded to Pakistan, various parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and even in Latin America. More than 1 million children, some years ago had already taken part in the citizen-led assessments. They now have their own organization called the PAL Network. And also early learning or early grade learning assessments have been carried out in many parts of the world, although not necessarily based on nationally representative samples. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over this because we're all very familiar of how extensive learning, the international learning metrics or international learning assessments are. Next slide, please. Less is known about the increase in national learning assessments. This graph shows that there's been a huge increase after the Dakar period, after the beginning of this century, in the number of countries, both in the global south and in the global north, that are conducting or have conducted at least one national learning assessment. This is, I think, one of the biggest changes that have occurred in the area of learning, and in some ways have also contributed to the discussions and to the kind of global learning metrics that we're now encountering. Next slide, please. Skip over to the next slide. When all is said and done, go back one, please. When all is said and done, this particular graph that was published in the World Development Report a couple of years ago shows that although there's been this proliferation of international and regional learning assessments, and to some extent some of these other non-standard, nevertheless, most of them are focused on the upper grades of primary education and to some extent in lower middle schools. But it's mainly middle income and high income countries that have been participating in these learning assessments. The vast majority of low and middle income countries have not participated or do not have information about the learning outcomes. And so as we look to global learning metrics, it's important to keep in mind that they tend to be skewed toward countries that are either upper middle or high income countries. Next slide, please. And skip over the next one. Now, obviously, one of the other major reasons why major efforts have been made to create global learning metrics is the definition or the centrality of learning in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and in particular, Sustainable Development Goal 4. Please, next page. That has, as you know, 10 targets, or 7 and 3 means of implementation, and many different global and thematic indicators. Next slide, please. The one target and global indicator that has had perhaps the greatest impact on the construction of a global learning metric is Target 4.1, that reads, by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. And even more important is the indicator, that is the percentage of children or young people at the end of each level of education. This would be the end of primary and the end of lower secondary, that achieve at least a minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics. It's this one target and this global indicator that a huge amount of resources and effort has been concentrated in developing a global learning metric that would speak to this particular kind of issue. Next slide, please. And in red, I've noted many other SDG 4 targets that speak to the importance of learning. For example, in Target 4.7, all learners acquire knowledge and skills related to the promotion of sustainable development and a culture of peace and global citizenship and cultural diversity, and even an indicator that looks at these issues, and even Target 4.7 that talks about adult and youth literacy and numeracy. Next slide, please. The fact of the matter, and moving to the next slide, the fact of the matter is that this new agenda, especially especially SDG 4, next slide, please, has in some ways the most extensive learning agenda ever conceived at the international level. It's broader, both in terms of subject domains and relevant skills and competencies, both for work and life, and a growing interest in altering the values, attitudes, and behavior of young people in order to address global challenges. It is both lifelong and life-wide, and is meant to be universally relevant. So this new agenda, these targets under SDG 4, are in fact the most extensive learning agenda ever been conceived and to which countries have committed. Next slide. Now, there are two different ways in which countries are being asked to account for their progress, or to provide some kind of reporting about progress that they're making on the different SDGs and the many different targets. We tend to forget that many countries are promoting their national voluntary national reviews, and quite a few countries have done that. But most of the attention is on the indicator framework, and in particular the global indicators. And there's at least one defined for each SDG target. Next, please. You can move to the next slide, please. So here we come back to Target 4.1, and in particular note the importance of not just looking at learning outcomes in general, but rather learning outcomes that are meant to be relevant and effective, although the indicator focuses more narrowly on reading and mathematics. Next slide. Okay, the final condition that I wish to bring to your attention is that even though many countries have been participating or conducting these learning assessments, there is no kind of agreed upon framework about how to report the findings of different assessments in some globally comparable manner. Different attempts are being made to develop these kind of global metrics. This is not something that there is international consensus or even scholarly consensus about how to go about compiling or calibrating information from different assessments onto a single scale. Next slide. And I think, most of us that are familiar with these assessments can certainly appreciate some very fundamental challenges here. These different learning assessments have been constructed to examine different kinds of content domains. They vary in terms of their test design, the kinds of items that are used, how they're operationalized and implemented could also affect the quality of the figures. The scaling methodologies that are used are quite different. The quality assurance procedures that have been put in place are quite different. So even though it seems quite straightforward to take data from different learning assessments, the fact of the matter is that there's an enormous amount of variation built into each of these assessments, both in terms of each assessment platform, but even in terms of the countries that are participating. Next slide. This gives you some idea of how different learning platforms are being combined into a global metric. You can see what has been done. The different assessment platforms are on the top. You can see PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, and then the regional assessments in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And what has been defined here is that different levels of proficiency at different learning platforms are being kind of calibrated in a way to develop a more harmonized or universal proficiency level, which would be on the far left of this figure. So you can see that there are 8 different levels that have been defined, and these are meant to be the levels that are reported in the global learning metric. Next slide. This just gives you an idea of some of the data sources that are used in order to create these global learning metrics. Next slide. Please push this. This just gives you an idea from this 2018 report that the World Bank began. This would be some of the first indications of placing countries across the entire income spectrum or different levels of development on a single metric. So here the World Bank reported the percentage of end of primary students who meet a minimum proficiency threshold for learning in mathematics. You can see enormous differences both within and across these different income categories. But again, this is the way in which these global learning metric data are being reported. Next slide. And based on this kind of data, the conclusion then would be something in the order of more than 600 million children and adults, which would be about 55 to 58% of the school-age population at these levels, have not or will not reach a minimum proficiency level in either reading and mathematics. And this becomes then the basis for arguing that there's a global learning crisis. All of this, by the way, is before the pandemic. And many people would argue that the learning crisis has been exacerbated in the interim years. Next slide. This breaks it down into different regions just to show some of the differences across different regions. Obviously, the crisis is much more acute in Sub-Saharan Africa and certain parts of Central and West Asia, and much less acute in other parts of the world. Next slide. Now, it's also important to point out that the World Bank has had its own agenda for using these global learning metrics, partly because of economists that have been focused on learning, cognitive learning in particular, as a proxy for human capital formation. And so in many ways, the World Bank has tried to incorporate this new learning data, in addition to data on enrollments, as a way of basically measuring human capital formation in different parts of the world, which they're convinced is a critical component for economic development. So their interest in learning metrics is less, let's say, in terms of trying to improve the quality of education being provided in different countries, and more as a means to improve the measurement of human capital and its formation in different countries, which is considered to be critical for subsequent economic development. If you haven't seen it, the article that was published in Nature by several of the World Bank economists, the lead author being Noam Angris, that it was published earlier this year, called Measuring Human Capital Using Global Learning Data. Certainly, I would suggest that you take a look at it. They've created a learning data set that has combined information across multiple learning platforms, beginning from 2000 to 2017 for 164 countries. And based on this, they do some very fancy analysis, both of the data. The next slide shows, for example, some of this, what this looks like. Here you can get a global map and now see average learning levels of different countries in the world during these 17 years, and which countries, the darker ones are the ones that have higher learning levels, the lighter ones have much lower learning levels. Next slide. I think one of the most important things also to keep in mind is that learning doesn't change very dramatically over time. Unlike enrollment levels that with concerted and targeted educational policies, enrollments can move up, whether it be at the primary or the secondary level. That's much less the case with respect to learning. We have many, although we have individual countries that have made a concerted effort and helped to, let's say, improve the learning levels. But one of the things that's quite clear from the right-hand side of the figure in front of you is that the learning levels in many regions on average only improves very slowly and in some cases actually declines. Next. So let me then conclude or use the last 5 minutes that I have to raise some concerns and some issues that I think are important for discussion here. First of all, as we've seen, the last few years has shown a huge shift in the kinds of policy commitments and discussion, certainly among international actors, so that now there's much more interested in the idea of quality education, and in particular, a wide range of learning outcomes. Certainly the targets under SDG 4 reflect this kind of broad concern about why learning should be central in educational policy circles at the national, regional, and international level, and also a growing demand for lifelong learning. But it is important to keep in mind that SDG 4 does articulate a fairly broad array of learning outcomes, not just in terms of reading and mathematics. And so at least in terms of the ambition is to look at learning outcomes across a much broader array of domains than we've seen so far. But the idea would be that countries, in order to really make progress on all the SDG 4 targets, would be expected to really build their capacity and robustly measure and assess learning across a wide array of learning domains. Next slide. That said, and now we've seen, with the support of the World Bank, that UNESCO's Institute for Statistics has been using and combining data from multiple assessment platforms to construct these global scales of learning. And we've seen some examples of that. These learning metrics almost exclusively focus on two outcomes, reading and mathematics, not even writing or comprehension in terms of language. Even though there's enormous interest in other more complex learning outcomes like sustainability, global citizenship, and various kinds of soft skills like team building or critical thinking or problem solving, there's been very little effort to measure and to monitor progress. And one would argue that to the extent that these areas are not measured, they will likely be diminished and devalued relative to other learning outcomes. And moreover, often these assessments tend to convey a very deficit model of many learners, especially those who come from poor, marginalized, and indigenous backgrounds. I think that's most acute in the area of reading. So there's very little attempt to say what's the mother language of some of the, let's say, less dominant cultural groups or ethnic minorities or religious or linguistic minorities in different countries, and how their learning may not be valued or even assessed in the various kinds of assessments. So these global learning metrics tend to reinforce a view that educational progress and learning outcomes can be easily measured and quantified, which I think is extremely problematic. They make very little attempt to really measure what might be relevant at the country level, since they really they spend very little time examining, for example, national sector plans or budget priorities, which would more articulate or reflect what are the real learning priorities and educational aims of the country. In the future, they may become the basis for international sanctions or reduce external assistance and aid if countries aren't making progress with respect to their position on this global ranking. So in short, the measurement of learning isn't simply a technical activity to be conducted more or less efficiently, but also a political activity that has many policy ramifications. Next slide. So I would say that there are some very powerful actors. I've mentioned a few, but including many of the donors that are providing support to countries that are focused, maybe disproportionately on country participation in these learning assessments. And one could argue that many countries would not be participating in some of the learning platforms if not for the support of donors. We should also note that there are many private companies that have a monetary interest in the promotion and construction of global learning metrics and their results, because they come along and then sell countries that are not doing so well various kinds of curricular or educational reform packages. So I think, again, that the scope and use and validity of these global learning metrics needs to be problematized because of the many policy and political ramifications. I'm going to skip over this. Well, just to say in closing that if SDG 4 is really going to be a driver of transformative change and address many challenges that we've heard a lot about in these last weeks around climate change and many others, then we really need to develop a much more holistic view of learning and learning synergies across different sectors, and certainly beyond the foundational skills. If global learning metrics are going to kind of meet that purpose, they need to be repurposed and really need to respond to the concerns and needs of educators, of parents, and certainly of broader constituencies about how education systems need to be reconsidered, reimagined in the future, going beyond the foundational skills that are the main emphasis up until now. So I thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to read a little bit more, this is a chapter that would provide some additional information about it. And I apologize for taking a couple, 2 minutes over what I've been allotted. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Aaron, for this excellent presentation. I will come back to you at the end of the session to answer questions. I now give the floor to Dr. Hanan KHALIFA from Cambridge University Press and Assessments. Dr. Hanan KHALIFA has held ministerial roles as advisor to ministers of education and university presidents, and worked for International Development Agency and world-renowned educational firms. Welcome, Dr. KHALIFA, and many thanks for accepting our invitation. Your presentation's title is Foreign Language Assessment in PISA.
Thank you, Nagy, and thank you for being with such a wonderful panel. I was wondering if you can show the presentation, and I'll take our audience through it, please.
You want me to share your presentation?
Please, if that's all right with you.
Okay.
I must say to the audience that I work and I live in Cambridge, but I was fortunate enough to come to Cairo to see my family, my mother and my brother. So hence, I'm actually broadcasting from her own dining room. Thank you, Naji. So, honorable guests and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to join you today and take you through our partnership with OECD, or shall I say the organization responsible for TIMSS and PISA. The idea of having PISA for foreign language assessment started in 2018. Next slide, please. Thank you. PISA, for those of you who may not be aware of it, is the world's largest survey of educational outcomes, which is taken up by 80 countries around the world. The survey is usually administered in a 3-year cycle since it was introduced at the start of this century. Each cycle tests a sample of 500,000 students who are 15 years old in compulsory education, regardless of which grade they are in, as long as they are 15 years old. PISA tests in mathematics, science, and reading literacy are based on real-life skills, rather than a particular curriculum. The tests do not assess theoretical knowledge, but focuses on students' ability to apply the knowledge they have in real-life situations. PISA assessment is a collaboration between OECD and participating countries who actually shape the assessment, what they want to look at, how they want to look at it, and how often do they want to implement it. All decisions are made by PISA governing board, which has representation from all participating countries. The reason that I'm saying this about PISA is that sometimes when I say OECD, they do not really link it up with PISA, so I thought I'll just give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour about it. Slide 3, next slide, please. So what triggers OECD interest in foreign language assessment? It is actually the continuous demand from PISA participating countries to introduce an assessment of foreign language skills in PISA. Countries are well aware of the impact PISA has on improving educational outcomes. In order to avoid reinventing the wheel, OECD looked at existing comparative studies which collected data from state schools at an international level. And they found out that there has been ones in the 70s and in the 90s. However, when they looked at these national profiles, they saw that it didn't really connect the data. But in 2011, SurveyLang focused on assessing the first and the second foreign languages spoken in Europe. Only 14 countries participated in SurveyLang, and the European Commission, wishing to saw a repeat of SurveyLang at an international level, was aware how complex and how costly endeavor is. So the answer really lied in PISA already having the setup, is able to look at trends. PISA participating countries have national teams in place, which enables the smooth operation. In addition, in 2018, as you may well know, that PISA Global Competence Survey results showed that 15-year-olds who speak more than one language are more aware of global issues. They are more willing to engage with the perspective of others. They demonstrated greater adaptability and are interested in learning about cultures. In essence, the results showed that 15-year-olds who speak more than one language are most likely to build bridges to other people, other countries, and cultures. Next slide, please. So what will PISA for foreign language assessment do and do not do? It will build on the existing state-of-art theory and practice. Its cognitive framework is based on the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages and the Socio-Cognitive Test Development and Validation Framework. It will benefit from the PISA infrastructure, such as the use of existing PISA platform and sampling software, the multi-level stage adaptive test design, and a design that allows for sufficient evidence to test model assumptions, identify eventual item bias, and anticipate the constraints deriving from measurement of trends. It will also make administration easier for countries in terms of regularity. So PISA foreign language assessment would be offered every 6 years, so every second cycle of PISA, which will allow actually for learning gain to take place, especially in language proficiency. And the marking will be done via OMR or auto marker or hybrid, pending the participating country's agreement. It will also implement foreign language assessment in phases. The first cycle will assess English. The choice of English was based on the country's consultation of what is the most predominant first foreign language to be assessed. PISA foreign language assessment will not act as a driver of methodological innovation. So whoever is presenting the items or the software, that is not about a methodological innovation. It will not be seen as a separate assessment program, and definitely it will not exclude countries because of technical preparedness or financial constraints or demands on schools. It will not cover all language skills or all languages in the first round. So it will only cover listening, speaking, and reading, but not writing. Next slide, please. So how is foreign language being defined? So PISA defined it as the ability to use a foreign language to communicate effectively. It requires a combination of communicative language competence and general competences that allow the foreign language learner to perform communicative language activities, reception, production, interaction, and mediation, which involve one or more, a combination of the following skills: reading, listening, speaking, or writing. It also requires the activation of appropriate language strategies. Next slide, please. PISA views foreign language proficiency as the joint outcome of two combined sources of influence: the learner and the task. These in turn determine the cognitive processes that the learner employs when using a foreign language. Learner and task dimensions interact with a broader sociocultural context, which can be thought of as the diverse range of situations in which the foreign language learning and use occur. Learning factors may include motivation, prior foreign language exposure, and self-efficacy or self-regulation in terms of learning. Task factors may include task purpose, function, complexity, time constraints, and linguistic demands. Next slide, please. Like I said, what will be assessed in the first cycle, it is listening, speaking, and reading. Next slide, please. The CFR, the PISA will be reporting the results according to the CEFR levels. The CFR, in a nutshell, has divided language proficiency into 6 broad levels, starting from A1 to C2. It describes what a basic user of a language can do at A levels until they progress to the C levels, where they become proficient users. As you see from the image, the levels are progressive. It's quite a jump from one level to another. The CFR has lots of illustrative scales for each language skill and strategies. So let's take a look at one of them. Next slide, please. I tried to color code this to make it a bit easier. So this is an illustrative scale for overall listening comprehension. And some of the levels, and that will sort of give you ideas about what the differences among levels. So if you look at the turquoise highlight, you will see more conditions in the A levels than the B levels. The turquoise highlight moving from the everyday, familiar, and personal to the unfamiliar. This is where the pink comes in. Academic and social, from concrete to abstract. So look at the green highlights. And if you look at the yellow highlight, it's moving from short and simple to extended and complex. And the amber highlight moving from single units to phrases and expressions to discourse and so on. So what you'll see is progression in terms of cognition and in terms of acquisition as well. So, next slide, please. What will PISA for foreign language assessment deliver? It will deliver international comparison of students' proficiency in a foreign language. We said that the foreign language is English, and it is anticipated that such assessment will lead to positive impact on learning and teaching English in the state sector schools, especially for countries who will be taking part in PISA FLA 2025. Results will not be reported on the PISA scales, as I said earlier, but according to the CFR proficiency levels. Using the CFR scale was an important decision, as it means that many countries will be able to see their performance on a scale that they are familiar with. At least English language teachers will be familiar with that and are already using it. For those of you who may not be familiar with the CFR, It has been around since 2000, but it really took off from 2008 onwards across many countries. And in the MENA region, you'll see lots of curriculums being aligned to it, assessment aligned to it in Latin America, in Central America, the same, and as well as Europe. And people, yes, like I said, it's for aligning curriculum and assessment. When interpreting the performance results, each country's context will be taken into account, especially about exposure to a foreign language. PISA will also deliver national diagnostics showing strengths and weaknesses in the mastery of foreign languages and outlining achievement gaps and variation between the school system within a country. The value of the survey also lies in analyzing trends year on year, as you may very well know. PISA will further deliver policy and practice lessons. The survey will provide the foundation for identifying the most effective policies and practices in terms of teaching and learning of foreign languages in school settings. And in terms of reporting and dissemination, as usual, a results report will be published, an international seminar, and the data will be available for national analyses. Next slide, please. This is just giving you the timeline. I'm not going to dwell here because I think you might be interested in the following slides. Next slide, please. What does the test look like? So you'll see that it's reading skills and task samples. And here is an example of a reading task. These are the different task types, moving from discrete definition with graphic all the way up to C1, multi-item, multiple choice, matching gap text. And in terms of cognitive processing, going from word recognition and Lexile access all the way up to building a mental model, creating a text level structure. Next slide, please. Here's a sample reading task. I'm not sure if you can really see it, but this is a gap task where you have the text, which have gaps, and then you have the multiple choice across whether it could be a phrase or it could be one word, depending on the level of the CFR. Next slide, please. In terms of listening, again, if you look at, for example, if we focus on B1, usually B1 in Europe, for example, could be a school leaving level. The B1, you can have an audio input, range of inputs, and the response format, a question or statement, or text-based options. And in terms of the cognitive processing, this is at the B1 level is where they should be mastering how to parse while they are listening. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, I don't have the audio for this one, but it will, if you read the script, I mean, it will pick up, you will need to pick up one of those, one of those graphics. Next slide, please. On the speaking is divided into 5 parts across the levels from pre-A1 to C1. And if you take a look at A2, for example, the learner should be able can give a simple description or presentation of people, living or working conditions, daily routines, likes and dislikes, etc., as a short series of simple phrases and sentences linked into a list. And next slide, please. And what you're seeing here is, sorry. Right, a sample speaking task taking a long turn, and you've got here a description of what that sample task is. I'd like you, so the examiner would say, I'd like you to talk about learning English. What are the best ways to learn English? Here are some ideas to help you. And you now have 1 minute to talk about what the best ways to learn English and why. And that's one of the sample tasks for a long turn or a monologue. Next slide, please. Some of you may wonder, so why OECD has partnered with Cambridge on the foreign language assessment, and if I can just take you back to at the start of my talk and explain a little bit more about the partnership. Our role in Cambridge is to advise on and contribute to the foreign language assessment framework, then design and develop the English tests for the computer-based or online delivery, developing the scoring guides, and training the speaking auto marker if the auto marker is being used. You may ask, why was Cambridge chosen for the partnership on the English language assessment? It's actually quite simple because it's the long-standing history that Cambridge has with the CFR, with its exams evolving and informing the CFR and vice versa. Cambridge also had a leadership role in 2011 survey which compared foreign language assessment across Europe, and also in the 2014 international surveys of languages. I believe I mentioned this earlier. The Cambridge exams are based on the theoretical model of sociocognitive framework, which is also the framework that PISA for foreign language is based on. So it made sense that for OECD to choose Cambridge as the partner on what I've said on developing the tests, writing the items, the scoring guides, and the speaking auto marker, and working with them on the auto marker. And I believe that's it from me. So thank you very much. And any question and answers, I've got my email if you'd like to get in touch at any time. Thank you, Abdel Nasser.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanan Khalifa, for your valuable and excellent presentation. I will back to you at the end of the session to answer questions. I now give the floor to Dr. Janet Lord from Manchester Metropolitan University. You have reader in education at Manchester Metropolitan University and head of education for health and education. You have worked as a social sciences teacher and lecturer in higher education. Welcome, Dr. Lord, and many thanks for accepting our invitation. Your presentation's title is Inclusion, Social Justice, and Empowerment in Education.
Thank you, and hello everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think you're going to share my slides for me, aren't you, as well?
Okay.
Thanks. So it's really lovely to be asked to speak, and I'm very interested in what the previous speakers have talked about. I'm talking particularly about how measurement is political, but I'm going to also talk about how education itself is political. And one of the things that I'm going to link into is what Erin was talking about, which is the notion of transformative change as well. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's great. So when I'm talking about transformative change, I'm going to talk about social justice and how that's a key criterion for excellent education and how that impacts on excellent education. So can we move on, please, to the next slide? Thank you. So I wanted to introduce myself first and say thank you for the lovely introduction. I just wanted to explain to you about Manchester Metropolitan University, where we have 37,000 students who study across 4 faculties. And what I do is look after the education, so all the teaching and learning in the Faculty of Health and Education. Move on to the slide, please. And I wanted to show you pictures of lovely Manchester. People say that it rains a lot in Manchester, but it wasn't raining on the days we took these. So this is one of our university buildings where education is situated. And we're very, very lucky to have fantastic resources in a fantastic city. So if we can move on, please. Thanks. I'm sure you will have seen pictures of Manchester and of the campus before. So that's what our campus looks like. And then the next slide will show you where we are in the world. And so showing you the UK and then showing Manchester. So every year where I work at Manchester Metropolitan, we train over 1,000 teachers, over 300 nurses, a number of social workers and psychologists and physiotherapists, and some speech and language therapists too. So a lot of practical work in the health and education sectors. Can we move on, please? Thank you. So what I wanted to talk to you about was social justice being a key condition to improve learning outcomes, I said earlier on. And this is something that Aaron referred to and we've talked about in relation to the SDGs. Next slide, please. One of the words that is used a lot is inclusion. The UNICEF definition of inclusion, all children in the same classrooms, in the same schools. And so starting to think about how we can create learning opportunities for groups who have traditionally been excluded. So it's quite interesting to look at the foreign language work that Hanan was talking about a second ago, because this means real opportunities for groups who've traditionally been excluded. So children with disabilities, speakers of minority languages, and what true inclusion, I think, can mean is how students from different backgrounds and with different abilities can learn together in an environment that's truly inclusive. Can we move on, please? Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? Thanks. So I looked at the San Diego Foundation's definition of social justice, and I don't think it's particularly contested. Everyone deserves equal economic, political and social rights and opportunities. But as we saw from the work that Aaron showed us earlier on, life isn't like that at all. I would contend that social justice depends on 4 essential goals, and they are human rights, access, participation, and equity. So what do we mean by that? Next slide, please. You may have seen this. This is a very common slide, seen it before, but the links between equality, equity, and justice. So if you see the 3 people watching the soccer match, you can see the differences there. So we're supporting everybody with equality. So that's equal treatment. Everybody's got a box, but still the person with the yellow shorts can't see the football match. If we think about equity, then we've given the person with the yellow shorts 2 boxes, so they can see. But let's think about justice, and let's think about ways of affecting systemic change. And what we've done in this case is we've changed the barrier completely so that everybody can see the game. That's the difference between equality, equity, and justice. I know you know those things, but I think it's worth having a graphic to explain it and to really make it clear. So next slide, please. Thank you. So how do we get there? And I'm going to talk about these things now. We're going to talk about the function of education. So actually, what is it all about? So we are measuring our 15-year-olds in all kinds of things, but we're measuring other children at all sorts of ages. Certainly in the UK, we've been very keen on measuring children from the age of about 3. So why are we doing what we're doing? I want to talk about our responsibilities as teacher educators and the responsibilities of teacher educators. And I'm going to briefly look at the work of Paulo Freire and Nell Noddings in relation to empowerment and the pedagogy of care. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about Michael Apple and the tasks of a critical educator that Apple suggests. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Gert Biester talks about the function of education. Very interesting to start to think about that. And I know when I talk to my students in the university about what the function of education is, they kind of look at me as if it's a really daft question. It's not a daft question at all. And I think we have to be very clear about why we're doing what we're doing before we start measuring things. So Biesta talks about the three domains of qualification, socialization, and subjectification. Qualification is reasonably obvious, getting the qualifications. Socialization, becoming part of the existing ways of being, what's going on there. And then finally, subjectification, sort of starting to become an individual with agency and being able to become more autonomous and independent in your own thinking. So that's what Biesta says. But of course, there are many, many people say different things. Could we have the next slide, please? And the next one. So you will recognize the picture of Paulo Freire, a hero, I think. So if we can move to the next slide as well, please. You will be aware, thank you, that Freire really was very critical of what's known as the banking model of education, where we're just filling learners' heads. And I like this image of a petrol pump, a gas pump, where learners are just being filled with knowledge. And then the head, you put the top back on the head and the learner goes away. And we know that education and learning are not like that at all. And Freire was very critical of this approach. Can we move on, please? Thank you. So in his very famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I think is a must read, and in particular, chapter 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, if you've not read it and know it off by heart, I really recommend it to you. What Freire talks about is how the disadvantaged, the disempowered, already actually know about the source of their oppression. It's not a surprise to them when they're told why they feel oppressed or why they are oppressed, and they know what must be done to overcome it. But unfortunately for them, what they don't have, because they don't have various forms of capital and various forms of privilege, is an organised approach to translating that knowledge into action. And that's something which is absolutely key. And we'll see that in not just in Freire's work, but in the work of Mike Appel as well. Next slide, please. And Freire says, and I think we need to remember this as we work in education, that we need to remember that there is that power dynamic, a conflict between the powerful and the powerless. And if we say nothing, if we stand by, then what we're doing is siding with the powerful. We're not being neutral. So Freire would suggest, and I would agree, that we can't be neutral in this. We need to make sure that we're very clear about where we stand, about our positionality in relation to these kinds of arguments. Next slide, please. So moving on from Freire to Nell Noddings and pedagogy of care. So one of the things that Noddings talks about is caring, and I don't mean that in a soft, fluffy kind of way. What I mean is that what Noddings says there, that if we care, then that everything else works. Everything else is predicated on that. The relations, the caring relations that we develop between teachers and learners, between the system and learners, they provide the foundation for successful pedagogical activity. And I think we know that already. Moving on, please, next slide. So what Noddings suggests is that we need to develop a relationship of caring and trusting so that students will accept what we try to teach. So then they're not seeing us as interfering with their lives, being done to, but what they're starting to see is the co-production and co-construction of work that comes from the integrity of that caring relationship. And then because that caring relationship is based on dialogue, we understand our learners. We know about what they need, what they're interested in, and so on. And that means that we become better educators. And that feeds in, of course, the third point that Noddings makes. We realise how much more than that standard curriculum is needed. We don't just need a list of things that we're going to do. We need other things as well. And then we become inspired to increase our own competencies. Very, very important, I think. So if we can move on from that slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the work of Michael Appel and his 9 tasks for critical educators. So thank you. What does Mike say those tasks are? If you ever get the opportunity to listen to Mike in real life or to watch some of his YouTube videos, I would really recommend the work of Michael to you. Very, very interesting, and really inspiring. So what does he suggest they are? And in a minute, I'll go through them. But I've put them up there. You can all read. You don't need me to go through them. But there are 9 particular tasks that we're going to go through now. The tasks that Michael says are the tasks for critical educators. Please, could we move on? Thank you. So the first task, I think this is really important, is that, and this links back to what I said about exploited people, disempowered people, understand the cause of their oppression. Mike says we should bear witness to negativity. We need to make sure we draw attention to the ways in which very often education policy and practice are connected to disempowerment, to exploitation, to power, to negative power relationships. And we need to make sure that we draw attention to the struggles against those kinds of relations. In other words, we need to stand up and we need to say something. Don't be neutral. That's what we're talking about. Next slide, please. Thank you. We also need to be active. And I know the first time that I met Mike, I was so do I have to go and do things then? And Mike said, absolutely, you're an educator. You have to go and do things. And one of the important things that we need to do as educators and as people who understand education is point to contradictions in the narratives that are going on in the world, and also point to the spaces where there is the possibility for action. And the documentation of those spaces and those agentic possibilities has to be done not just at the institutional level, but also at the level of individual experience. And I'm interested that one of the things that I think is really key here is that if we don't do that, then research can very easily lead to cynicism or despair. So action is absolutely key as well. Can we move on, please? Thank you. Mike suggests we should act as what he calls critical secretaries. So we need to stop thinking about research as perhaps we may traditionally have thought about research. And instead, we need to write about the groups of people and the social movements who are engaged in challenging power relationships. So we need to write about what's going on. Perhaps that's not what we would traditionally have thought of as research, but that kind of work can be very powerful, particularly when it's co-constructed, co-produced, and accompanied by truly cooperative work with the groups who are working to build successful counter-hegemonic programs, counter-hegemonic institutions, and alternatives to the existing relations of unequal power. Can we move on, please? Thank you. So this slide slightly goes back to when I was saying, what do we count as education? But we also need to think about what counts as knowledge and what counts as socially just education and who defines those things. And this is something that you will be familiar with. But it's important, this links also to the critical secretary work, that we need to keep the traditions of radical and progressive work alive in the face of many attacks that makes it very difficult for them to stay alive. And they can be attacks from the establishment or more locally. And what we need to do is keep those political traditions alive, the theoretical ones, the empirical ones, the historical ones, but also work with the people in those areas to extend and supportively criticize them, so that what we're doing is we're keeping alive that vision, that wonderful vision, that wonderful sense of dreaming about what's possible. And that's what we need to keep alive when we're working in education. Thank you. If we can move on. Another task, I think this is really important, and it's something that very often academics in particular are very bad about. We need to make sure that as we're talking, that we're understandable, that we think about our audience and we make sure that we're understood, so that we don't talk using words that are not words that people understand, that we don't talk about things that don't make any sense because the language is wrong. So it's really important as part of our work as activists to learn how to speak in different registers and to say things that are really important in ways that mean that the audience or the reader doesn't have to do all the work. And I think when you read really, really good educators' work, you see that happening and you think, yeah, I get that. The best people to explain things are very often the people who explain something really, really clearly in very simple terms where you think, yeah, I get it. That's important that we learn to do that and that we don't bamboozle people or blind them with science. Moving on, please. Thank you. Another task that Mike talks about is don't take a seat on the balcony. Let's not just sit there and watch. Work with the progressive movements that our work supports and learn from them. We can't live on the balcony. What we must do, and I've mentioned this before, is we can't be neutral and we can't be indifferent from the struggles. And going back to Aaron's work, these are struggles where the future of the world is at stake, as we've seen very, very clearly in the data that Aaron presented to us earlier on. So it's important that we don't just sit there, and particularly sit there with a mask on in the picture of Venice that I've put there, and pretend that it doesn't matter to us. We have to do things. It does matter. We mustn't sit on the balcony and just watch things happen. Move on, please. And part of that, not sitting on a balcony, part of not being a critical secretary, part of those things is to be a mentor and be a role model for people. Demonstrate what it means to be deeply committed to your mission, to your vision, to social justice, to those things. Demonstrate what it means to be an excellent researcher, whatever research means. And as I just said, we perhaps need to think about how we redefine research, but also demonstrate what it means to be a committed working member of a society, such as the ones that many of us live in, that are scarred by inequalities, that are tarred by inequalities. So we need to be an excellent researcher and also an important member of society. And I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do. We need to blend those roles together and try and commit to doing that research and to participate in movements whose aim is disrupting those power relationships and integrate that into the work, the talking, the teaching that we do. That's absolutely key. Moving on, please. We're privileged. Many of us are privileged. I think just the fact we're here today means that we're privileged. I'm very privileged. And one of the things I see as part of my job is to open up the spaces at the university where I work. And where the university that I work in is in a very disadvantaged area of one of the biggest cities in Europe. And it's really important that I open up the university, that I try to do that to the people who aren't there and for the people who don't have a voice in those spaces, and to many other spaces where I've got access as a privileged professional, but actually many people don't have access. So one of my tasks as a critical educator is to make sure I use my privilege. Thank you. So I just mentioned this before. Doing these things isn't a laugh a minute. It's not meant to be. You can't do everything at once. That's a pretty big ask, those 9 tasks. But to start with, I think one of the things that I would suggest is that think about your own privilege. Think about your own structural location. Where are you in the world and what can you do to open up spaces, be a critical secretary, be a committed mentor, those things. And also, what are your overt and tacit commitments already? What are your values? What are your beliefs? Which I think takes us back to the work of BEASTA. What are we doing in relation to education? What is the function of it? And how can we make sure that we've got social justice as a precondition for excellent outcomes, however we're going to define or measure outcomes? Next slide, please. So I believe this. I believe this with every bone in my body, that education is the way forward here. And I use this quote in Mandela as the strapline in one of my latest books. It's something I use in my email signature. It's through education that we can change the world, but we need to think about what education is. We need to start thinking about whether we are weighing the pig all the time or whether we sometimes perhaps need to feed the pig as well. education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change things, and we need to use our privilege, our ability as critical secretaries to do that. So moving on, please. I've put my email address there, and please do continue the discussion. If you'd like to contact me, I'd be delighted to hear from you. It would be lovely to hear from you and to continue the discussion there. So please do get in touch. And my final slide is just references. And if you would like any more information, I'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. And thank you very much for the invitation again to come and speak to you today and to be with you this afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lord, for this excellent presentation. I will come back to you at the end of this session to answer questions. I now give the floor to Dr. Mario BRUN from Center for Innovation and Development in Education and Technology, Argentina. He has developed an extensive research experience in Chile and acts as a consultant for several international agencies such as UNESCO and OECD. Welcome, Dr. Mario BRUN. Please unmute micro.
It's okay now?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, Abdel Nasser, for the invitation to be part of this important event. I send my greetings to my distinguished colleagues on this session and to the audience that is following or perhaps will follow this session later. Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen, to share my presentation. Please let me know if everything is okay. Are you seeing the first slide?
Not yet.
Let me check again, please. What about now?
Not yet. Okay, now.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much again. I will present what I consider is an overview. I'm sorry. Okay. What I believe it's an overview of relevant international information about large-scale assessment, some initial considerations, then I will address aspects related to the consequences and the impacts of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic on education. And finally, I will share with you some thoughts about the emerging challenges for accessing learning in the current context and in the future in a post-pandemic scenario. During the last 2 decades, main international large-scale assessments, from now on ILSAs, as you know, PISA, TIMSS, and PIRLS, have been playing a key role as comprehensive and rigorous resources to monitor and improve the achievement of education systems worldwide. In this sense, these 3 studies, the 3 ILSAs, provide important insights into how a country's education system is performing and provide very useful and rigorous information to countries for making evidence-informed decisions on aspects related to their educational policies. In fact, these 3 studies has an impressive acceptance and validation from the international community. This map shows how many countries are implementing these studies in their territories. And they probably pursue a number of goals that are related to different areas for improvement, such as the improvement of the education system as a whole, teaching and learning practices, monitoring, evaluation, and accountability processes, comparisons and benchmarking, educational equity, and curriculum reform. In this sense, this map shows the distribution of these uses and goals across the world in the different countries. And they also use the results of these international assessments to invest in different areas, such as teacher training and professional development, education funding, and also education materials and time resources. Consequently, and even though each national education system is unique and shaped by different needs, goals, resources, and priorities, we may conclude with a number of intentions, of goals, of purposes for a country to participate in an ILSA. Yeah, I prepared this slide to let you what I think are the main goals of participating in an ILSA. However, sadly, these pictures are very familiar to us, because when the unprecedented situation of the COVID pandemic appeared, everything changed, and we faced the largest education crisis of our lives, whose consequences will affect students' learning performance for a long time. And I think that the main relevant changes and impacts of the pandemic on education systems are related to school closures, student dropout, learning loss, widening of inequalities and gaps, the use of digital technologies, connectivity and remote learning, and the financing of education. Let's start with the school shutdown. And let's quantify the main damages of school closures to the stakeholders of education systems. We can see that 1.6 billion learners were out of school in almost 200 countries. Over 100 million teachers and school staff were impacted by the shutdown. And to this day, more than 55 million learners are still affected by closures at their schools, and in 14 countries, schools remain fully closed. This map shows in different shades of blue the updated situation worldwide regarding the total duration in weeks of school shutdown. As seen, many countries have closed their schools for an entire school year or even more. Millions of students lost 3/4 or even almost all in-person learning, and they mostly belong to a few developing countries, as shown in this image. And this map shows the current situation across the world. The huge number of hours of in-person classes missed and other damages produced by school shutdown are not evenly distributed among different geographic regions. We can see that the most severe effects of closure were suffered by regions involving countries with low and lower middle income, such as South and East Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Eastern and Southern Africa. In this sense, and as expected, the previously data sadly lead to expect a higher dropout rate worldwide, and UNICEF estimates that no less than 24 million students will drop out of school due to the pandemic. Clearly, schools closed mean learning loss. The lack of schooling has a double negative impact on students' learning, since children miss the opportunity to learn and also forget what they learned before. And this mostly affects children from vulnerable groups such as girls, refugees, students with disabilities, among others. It's clear that each national context is unique. Therefore, the countries are facing the crisis diversely regarding school closures and teacher responses, and therefore they are experiencing impacts on learning of different extent and nature. In many cases, this implies a significant step back in terms of previous educational gains to be mitigated by target strategies. For instance, we can see in this graphic a correlation between the lack of schooling and reading performance, since countries with longer closures in secondary school are precisely those with the lowest scores in reading in PISA 2018. Therefore, the effects are really huge. In order to gauge the extent of learning loss and the lack of schooling, the World Bank and the UNESCO Institute of Statistics launched a new multidimensional indicator named the learning poverty, defined through deprivation of schooling and of learning. In this interesting conceptual framework, students in learning poverty are those having schooling deprivation or learning deprivation, and based on this, children in learning poverty will not reach the minimum proficiency level expected. Simulations involving primary schools show that the share of children in learning poverty will rise from 53 to 63% due to school shutdowns, and it means 100 million children falling below the minimum proficiency level due to the impact of the pandemic. This clearly will contribute to widen the inequalities and gaps. In any post-pandemic scenario, negative effects are expected mainly in terms of lower average scores and a higher dropout rates. And this implies that only a small share of secondary students in low-income countries will have the basic set of skills to be demanded by the job market in the few years. And this data were produced before the pandemic. So the scenario right now is even worse. This implies clearly less skilled workers, more poverty, and more inequality. In fact, and for the very first time, the Human Development Index collapsed, and this represents a huge global setback. In another line, these digital resources, connectivity, and remote learning played a starring role during the pandemic. And regarding this, things are not as easy as they seem. The figures of children and young people lacking internet access at home are massive. There are also huge inequalities based on geographic region, country income group, and place of residence. This map, shown in different shades of red, the percentages of population with no access to the internet across the world. In nearly 70 countries, more than half the population has no internet access at all. We can clearly observe the gaps by comparing children and young people with internet access at home by region, and the less favored are different regions from Africa and South Asia. The gaps are always present in different criteria. For example, when it comes to make comparisons based on the country income group, as expected, the lowest percentage of children and young people with internet access at home are those from low and lower middle income countries. And when analyzing the data based on place of residence and country income group, it's not surprising that the lowest percentage corresponds to rural populations in low and lower middle income countries. And we can see that the gap with other income groups and place of residence is shocking. A recent study found a relationship based on which countries with higher percentage of children and young people without internet access at home are those with the lowest GNI per capita. It's clear that the role of education in bridging inequalities and gaps are not possible to be solved by the use of digital technologies, connectivity, and remote learning with these infrastructural gaps. Regarding the remote learning, which assume diverse modalities and delivery channels across the world during the pandemic, there are also sharp differences between geographic regions and leave millions of children that cannot be reached by digital and broadcast remote learning strategies. Another important aspect to be considered is the financing of education. At financial level, the challenge to be faced by education systems are significant, and the negative consequences of the pandemic on national economies worldwide might represent additional difficulties for education budget, as well as for the foreseen investment, mainly in low and lower middle income countries. In fact, the global financial gap to reach the SDG 4, already existing before the pandemic, is expected to increase due to the pandemic in about 1/3. Moreover, programs for supporting education equity and quality are in danger in many countries due to the highlight aspects. However, the most important thing is not the amount of money spent on education, but the way the financial resources are allocated and used. And in this sense, all the previous references to the negative critical changes and effects of pandemic on education, the school closures, the learning loss, the dropout rates, the lack of internet access, will shape a new and even more comprehensive and different conception of assessment. These challenges could lead us to redefine the assessment, paying more attention to those contextual and background aspects that determine or influence on learning score. We can consider that the chronological sequence of the assessment, the international large-scale assessments, the pandemic broke it, and that should be solved, but the recovery of normality will take considerable time. In this sense, the main challenges for me emerged from the pandemic at methodological level for the ILSAs are the revision or update of existing indicators, the design, the creation of new indicators and benchmark specifically relate to the pandemic, its impacts, its features. Also, the revision of the application procedures, if needed, are a relevant question. And finally, the reflection on new approaches regarding the analysis and the use of results from ILSAs. In this sense, and considering the existing indicators, the main ILSAs have already been collecting pertinent and relevant contextual information about factors affecting learning. We can see in these following slides some contextual factors and indicators already included in PISA, TIMSS, and PIRLS. There are a few more. These indicators already used might be revised, updated, or redefined in light of other relevant pandemic-related factors to better reflect that aspects that will shape students' performances in a post-pandemic scenario. In this sense, these novel factors emerge from the response of education system to the COVID-19 emergency, involve the need for creating as well new indicators and measures and the new approaches on how learning will be affected by original new pandemic-related factors. For example, those in this list, I could mention learning recovery, learning loss, respond to pandemic from educational and general authorities, features of online classes, frequency, modality, and one very special, I think we must highlight, there is the stakeholders' social and emotional well-being and mental health, a very important aspect to be considered during the recovery of education. As example, we can see some specific indicators to monitor impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on education proposed last year by the UNESCO. They are classified into different groups, such as access, protection, and well-being, teachers, learning, and gender equality. As another example, this table shows diverse indicators associated to students' well-being, and taking into consideration that there are some important publications and recent from published last year and this one, I prepared a list for the interested people to revise and to explore, alluding to the need of revising or designing indicators relate to the pandemic. In addition to the redefinition or update, or even the creation of new indicators, it's necessary to consider the possible revision of application procedures, if necessary, for introducing eventual improvement in the corresponding instruments and processes. Also, and it's the last point of the methodological challenges, the reflection on new approaches for analyzing and using result of ILSAs. I found an example of a new approach, which is the analytical framework developed to define the educational prosperity approach of the international study PISA for development, which involved a set of factors influencing a number of outcomes, each one of them comprising different indicators. This kind of innovation in new approaches, in new frameworks, will be truly useful in the post-pandemic scenario. We can also take into consideration regarding new approaches and ways to analyze and use assessment results that outcomes from ILSAs are often misunderstood. Clearly, it's very usual that results from ILSAs are underused and their full potential or reaches is fully underexploited. All the problems in the use an analysis of results from these studies will be surely deepened by the pandemic. That's why the international community should work together to make better use and exploitation of such results. This could be done by carrying out different academic research and studies that should be strongly promoted and supported by international organizations, such as secondary analysis of ILSA's results, cross-analysis and triangulation between results from different assessments and academic studies, and mainly new research, including specifically impact evaluation. I put a specific focus on this because we lack of sufficient studies in general for education about impact evaluation, but the pandemic provides an excellent opportunity to go deeper with this kind of studies. Some key research areas suggested by UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank recently are the ones in this slide. We can see the monitoring of student dropout and disengagement, the plans for remediation and tracking of the effectiveness of response, the effectiveness also of health, response on health, and again, psychosocial support to well-being and better mental health. Considering these topics proposed by the aforementioned organizations, an example of ongoing research on the addressed topics is this one, the COVID-19 Milo, which is a study being carried out to examine the impact of the pandemic in the outcomes in reading and mathematics in 6 African countries, and also to evaluate the effectiveness of remote learning modalities and mechanisms utilized during the shutdown. So far, I mentioned the most significant effects of the COVID-19 crisis on education and the challenges for the international large-scale assessments for adapting and better reflecting the new educational reality. Among those aspects that I consider as the most important for the short and medium term regarding the assessment of learning in the post-pandemic era, I'd like to emphasize the following. The review of designs and frameworks corresponding to the main international large-scale assessments in light of the new information and data provided by the pandemic context, the update and development of indicator benchmark to better reflect the influence of these factors on learning, the promotion and support of research, specific research, and once again, I'd like to highlight the importance of impact evaluation. And finally, to this group, the capitalization of international experiences and practices and information, as well as the results of studies and assessments in order to develop more accurate, more precise and effective policies in the field of education. Also, the development of national emergency plans for the education system, I consider it's a crucial aspect in order to be prepared to face another eventual pandemic or other adverse regional global situation or catastrophe in the coming years, including those involving the lack of communication. Another very important aspect for me is the need of supporting and funding actions aimed at preparing professional teams, in other words, actions oriented to capacity building, mainly in aspects related to technical and professional skills oriented to the stakeholders in developed countries. And finally, a specific mention, I should highlight the enormous efforts made in a very short period by international organizations to cooperate for facing the challenge of education during the pandemic and in a post-pandemic scenario. Initiatives at the international level, such as the Global Education Coalition, the leading role of UNESCO, UNICEF, OECD, the World Bank, IEA, among others, is enormous. And I also believe that a new era of international cooperation could emerge as a consequence of the pandemic. Finally, the extent and pace of the adaptation of international large-scale assessment to successfully face the changes suffered, let's see, by education systems during the pandemic will become essential for the achievement of their goals in accessing education systems that change dramatically and forever. Thank you very much for your attention. The first slide contains my email, and I'll be delighted to be in touch with my distinguished colleagues or the audience anytime. Thank you very much once again for your attention.
I think your microphone's on mute, Naji.
Dr. Aaron, you can hear me? Okay. Many thanks, Dr. Mario BRUN, for your excellent presentation. And now I will ask you some questions. The first to Dr. Aaron BENAVOT. How to make data from global learning metrics promoting real improvements in the provision of quality education, and how to preserve specificities in different countries in these standardized assessments?
So that's a very important question. Thank you very much. One of the interesting things about many of these learning assessments is how little they involve teachers and educators and even parents to some extent. I think it's incredibly important for the assessments if indeed the main focus is how to enable those that are most closely involved in the learning process in local classrooms and local schools to both have a say in the development and the implementation and the kind of construction of these assessments, and also be engaged in how the information that's been collected is understood, is discussed, is brought to bear on the kinds of challenges that they're facing on a daily basis. So if these assessments are mainly speaking to the sensibilities of high-level policymakers and to those that are engaged in kind of high-level discussions, then I think that their impact in terms of really improving learning on the ground and what goes on in classrooms is going to be quite limited. So we certainly get a lot of information. We could say we're a little bit in information overload, but I think that needs to be a much closer feedback loop with those that are involved in the actual construction of learning processes in classrooms and in local school districts. So I think that that's a critical part of it. And I think that one of the things that would come about is that they would focus more on the tools that they have at their disposal, such as textbooks, such as the syllabi, such as the kind of pedagogical tools that they would have available, and even the extent to which more formative assessments might be very valuable in enabling students to really improve their learning growth over time. And I would also say that, and I have a feeling that the people that are involved in a lot of the school-based assessments are not fully appreciative, but it certainly came home during the pandemic, is the critical importance of the home, of parents, of other adults that children come into contact with as they're not able to go to school, but to what extent does the literacy, the educational curiosity, the other resources that parents have at home that they can supplement, augment, and enhance and enrich the learning processes of children. If the only learning that we assume that takes place is learning that goes on in the school, then we're very mistaken in our models. So I think we need to have a much more holistic and participatory way in which we develop these assessments and data to really have impact on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Aaron BENAVOT. The second question is to Dr. Hanan KHALIFA. How can be assessed the speaking and listening skills in a large-scale assessment such as PISA, and based in which criteria the languages to be assessed will be chosen?
Okay, so the first foreign language is going to be English, and the choice of the first foreign language comes from the participating countries. So the PISA governing board would have asked all of the countries whether they're happy to go with the first foreign language as English. What comes next? That goes through the consultation with the PISA governing body. So that is about what language. There are discussions about whether the rubric, for example, should be in Spanish or in Hebrew, or it could be in Arabic, but the text itself is in English. The listening will be dealt with having headsets, which are not very expensive, where you can talk into the mic when you do the speaking, and the speaking is recorded while you are responding to a prompt.
Remotely or in presential?
It will be part of the PISA assessment. So it's whatever happens in the country with all of the national coordinators. It's not going to be something totally different. So the kids will be, or the students will be sitting in a classroom with certain distance between them, so that they are not, you cannot hear interference when they are listening and speaking into the mic. The marking of it will happen remotely, and everything is happening online.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The third question to Dr. Janet Lord. How do large-scale assessment can contribute to promote social and emotional skills?
Really interesting question. I don't know if it can. Actually, I think in terms of social and emotional skills, I'm not sure that's the way forward. I think there are other ways in which we can perhaps deal better with developing those skills. And I think we're at risk in education. I mentioned before when I was talking about weighing the pig all the time, but actually sometimes what we need to do is stop measuring and start actually doing something. And so in terms of social and emotional skills, I think I was just thinking about what we were talking about before, that the pandemic has been a massive problem for many young people in relation to social and emotional skills. And actually what we need to do is get them used to reconnecting, get those ideas about how do we reconnect with our studies, how do we reconnect with our learning and so on. And I'm not sure that large-scale assessment is the way to do that, to be honest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lord. The third question to Dr. Mario BRUN: how developing countries can do significant improvement in their ranking in large-scale assessment, and how can they prevent risks in amid pandemics?
I can't hear you well, Abdenasser. Could you please repeat the question?
How developing countries can do significant improvement in their ranking in large-scale assessment, and how can they prevent risks in amid pandemics?
Well, I think they are two different questions. The first one could be formulated before the pandemic. It's a very valid question to improve a national education system. But my point is that the disruption of the pandemic really broke the normality of education, and therefore we can conceive a before and an after of the pandemic in assessing education, since all the previous scores for a country, an ex-country, perhaps are not fully valid today, since the students belonging to this country lack of internet access at home, so the remote learning is not an option for a better learning. And therefore, my point is that international efforts, and of course regional and national ones, should be developed in the short term for reflecting how deep are the damages produced by the pandemic in many education systems. Perhaps high-income countries with a healthy economy could rapidly recover from the pandemic. But for example, my region, Latin America, is having enormous problems, economical, social problems, and the pandemic really broke the education system. So my point is that it will be very difficult to conceive how to compare previous information before the pandemic and the new data to be obtained, to be collected after the pandemic. And therefore, new information should be collected to better reflect the specific scenario, national scenario of each country, each participating country, not also in international large-scale assessment, but also in national assessment and other instances for assessing education in each country. Yeah.
Thank you, Mario. And thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Hanan, for your participation in CIMQUSEF18. And I hope we can meet you another time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye to her.
Goodbye.
Thank you for organizing this, Naji. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very much appreciate your efforts too.
Thank you.
Great job.